What happens when a successful executive goes undercover in his own company, only to discover the ugly truth about workplace discrimination? Marcus Williams thought he knew his business inside and out. As the founder and CEO of Williams Security Solutions, a multi-million-dollar corporation employing over 2,000 people across 15 states, he prided himself on creating an inclusive workplace. But when anonymous complaints started flooding HR about racial bias in the Chicago branch, Marcus made a decision that would cost him everything he'd built. He decided to go undercover as a regular security guard to see the truth for himself. What he discovered in those fluorescent-lit hallways and employee break rooms would shatter his faith in humanity, test his moral compass, and ultimately force him to choose between his empire and his conscience. Because sometimes doing the right thing means losing everything you've worked for. This is the true story of how one man's quest for justice turned him from a respected CEO into an unemployed whistleblower, and how the aftermath of his choice created ripples that reached the highest levels of corporate America. The most shocking part? The discrimination wasn't coming from W. Marcus Williams sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor of the Williams Tower in downtown Atlanta, staring at the stack of complaints that had arrived on his desk that morning. Each one told a similar story of discrimination, harassment, and toxic workplace culture at the Chicago branch of his security company. The irony wasn't lost on him that complaints about a security company not providing safety for its own employees. He had built Williams Security Solutions from nothing. 22 years ago, he was a former Marine sergeant with a business degree and a dream to create something meaningful. Starting with just himself and 2 fellow veterans, they provided security services for small businesses in Atlanta. Through hard work, strategic partnerships, and an unwavering commitment to excellence, the company had grown into one of the largest private security firms in the Southeast. Marcus prided himself on the company culture he had created. Williams Security Solutions wasn't just another corporate machine grinding up employees for profit. It was a place where veterans found purpose, where single mothers could work flexible schedules, where people of all backgrounds could build careers. At least, that's what he had always believed. The first complaint had arrived 3 weeks ago. Sarah Chun, a security supervisor in Chicago, had filed a formal grievance claiming she was passed over for promotion repeatedly in favor of less qualified male colleagues. She detailed instances where her ideas were dismissed in meetings, only to be praised when restated by male team members. Her direct supervisor, Jim Morrison, allegedly told her that clients preferred dealing with men in security matters. Marcus had initially dismissed it as an isolated incident. Every large company dealt with personality conflicts and occasional management issues. He had instructed HR to investigate and assumed the matter would be resolved quietly. But then, more complaints arrived. Kevin Thompson, a black security guard working the night shift at a major corporate client, reported that Morrison had repeatedly assigned him the worst shifts and locations despite his seniority and excellent performance reviews. When Kevin requested better assignments, Morrison allegedly told him he should be grateful to have a job at all, and that some clients specifically requested white guards for their facilities. The complaints kept coming. Maria Rodriguez documented how Morrison created hostile work environment for Spanish-speaking employees, mocking their accents during team meetings, and implementing English-only policies that served no business purpose. David Kim, an Asian American security specialist with a master's degree in criminal justice, reported being consistently assigned to minor tasks, while less qualified colleagues handled important client relationships. What disturbed Marcus most wasn't just the individual
We need to be
incidents,
absolutely precise here.
I understand. What's the biggest risk?
Execution.
All
One
complaints
misstep
pointed
costs
to
us
the
everything.
same
Then let's
source.
review it now.
Jim Morrison, the regional manager he had personally hired and promoted. Morrison had been with the company for 8 years, starting as a guard and working his way up through dedication and what Marcus had perceived as strong leadership skills. Marcus had met Morrison during a company-wide conference 5 years ago. He was impressed by the man's knowledge of security protocols, his ability to manage large teams, and his reported success in client retention. Morrison presented himself as a no-nonsense manager who got results. His Chicago branch consistently met revenue targets and maintained high client satisfaction scores. But numbers could lie. Marcus was learning. Behind the successful metrics was a toxic culture that contradicted everything Williams Security Solutions was supposed to represent. The complaints painted a picture of systematic discrimination that had been hidden from upper management through careful manipulation of reporting structures and intimidation of victims. Marcus called his head of human resources, Janet Rodriguez, into his office. Janet had been with the company for 12 years and had helped build many of the policies designed to prevent exactly the kind of behavior described in the complaints. "Tell me honestly, Janet," Marcus said, sliding the stack of papers across his mahogany desk. "How did we miss this?" Janet's face grew pale as she reviewed the documents. She had seen some of these complaints individually, but seeing them together revealed the scope of the problem. "Marcus, I had no idea it was this extensive. Morrison's been very clever about how he handles these situations. Most of the time, employees don't file formal complaints because they're afraid of retaliation." "Retaliation? What kind of retaliation?" "Subtle things. Schedule changes, assignment modifications, performance reviews that suddenly become more critical. Morrison knows how to stay just within the bounds of what he can defend legally while making life miserable for anyone who challenges him." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same righteous fury that had driven him to excellence in the Marines. But this wasn't a battlefield where enemies were clearly identified and rules of engagement were straightforward. This was his own company, his own people, and somehow he had failed them. "Why didn't anyone come directly to me?" he asked. "Some tried," Janet admitted reluctantly. "But Morrison has cultivated relationships with people in upper management. When complaints reached certain levels, they were often redirected back to him to handle internally. He's very good at presenting himself as the voice of reason, explaining away problems as misunderstandings or personality conflicts." Marcus realized with growing horror that his company's hierarchy, designed to efficiently manage thousands of employees across multiple states, had become a shield protecting exactly the kind of manager he never wanted in his organization. Morrison had learned to game the system, using corporate processes as weapons against the very people those processes were meant to protect. He thought about all the company meetings where he had spoken about values, integrity, and respect for all employees. How hollow those words must have sounded to employees like Sarah, Kevin, Maria, and David, who were living daily with the reality of Morrison's management style while hearing corporate messages about equality and opportunity. The financial implications were also becoming clear. Several of the complainants had already left the company, taking their experience and training to competitors. Client relationships were suffering as word spread through industry networks about internal problems. Marcus knew that in the security industry, reputation was everything. Clients trusted them with their most valuable assets and sensitive information. If Williams Security Solutions couldn't manage its own workplace culture, how could clients trust them with anything else? Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't rely on traditional corporate investigation methods. Morrison was too skilled at manipulation, too entrenched in the system. If Marcus wanted to understand what was really happening in Chicago, he needed to see it firsthand. He called his trusted assistant, Patricia Williams, into his office. Patricia had been with him since the early days and was one of the few people who knew every aspect of the business operations. More importantly, she was someone whose discretion he trusted completely. "Patricia, I need you to create a new identity for me in our employment system," he said. "I'm going undercover in Chicago." Patricia's eyes widened. "Marcus, that's incredibly risky. If this gets out, it could destroy your credibility with employees, clients, everyone. And if I don't do this, we might lose everything anyway," Marcus replied. "I need to know what's really happening out there. I need to see how our employees are being treated when they think no one important is watching." Over the next week, Patricia worked with a small team of trusted IT professionals to create Marcus's new identity. On paper, he became Marcus Johnson, a former military police officer looking for steady work in private security. His background was close enough to his real experience that he could answer questions naturally, but different enough to avoid recognition. The physical transformation required more effort. Marcus shaved his signature beard, traded his expensive suits for basic work clothes, and adopted the posture and speech patterns of someone looking for employment rather than someone who owned the company. He practiced in front of mirrors, worked with an acting coach his daughter had recommended, and studied video footage of entry-level employee interactions. The night before flying to Chicago, Marcus sat in his home office, looking at family photos and wondering if he was making the right choice. His wife, Angela, had been supportive but worried about the risks. His children, now adults with their own careers, thought he was either very brave or very foolish. "Dad," his daughter Carmen had said during dinner that evening, "you built this company to be better than this. Trust the system you created." But Marcus had lost faith in systems. He had seen too many. Marcus arrived at the Chicago Williams Security Solutions office at 8 in the morning, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt from a discount store. He carried a worn leather portfolio containing his fabricated resume and military discharge papers that Patricia's team had expertly created. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the reception desk, not from nervousness about the deception, but from anticipation of what he might discover. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, greeted him with a genuine smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm here about the security guard position," Marcus said, deliberately softening his usual commanding tone. "I called yesterday, and someone said I could come in to fill out an application." Ashley's demeanor remained friendly as she handed him a clipboard with forms. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. Just fill these out, and someone from HR will be with you shortly. Can I get you some coffee while you wait?" Marcus was struck by the warmth of her greeting. This was exactly the kind of treatment he expected from his company. But as he sat in the waiting area filling out paperwork, he began to notice subtle dynamics that would have been invisible from his executive suite. A young Latino man in a security uniform walked past, heading toward the back offices. Ashley called out, "Hey, Carlos, Mr. Morrison wants to see you when you get a chance." Carlos's expression immediately changed from casual to worried. "Do you know what about?" "Nah, probably nothing serious," Ashley replied. But Marcus caught the sympathetic look she gave Carlos, and the way her voice carried a note of concern that suggested this wasn't routine. 20 minutes later, Carlos emerged from the back offices looking defeated. His uniform shirt was untucked, his shoulders slumped, and he avoided eye contact with everyone as he headed for the exit. Marcus watched Ashley's face and saw a flicker of anger that she quickly suppressed. "Mr. Johnson?" A woman in business attire approached. "I'm Sandra Mills from Human Resources. Thanks for coming in today." Sandra led him to a small conference room for the interview. She was professional and thorough, asking about his military experience, his interest in security work, and his availability for different shifts. Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by her professionalism and knowledge. "Your background looks excellent," Sandra said, reviewing his fabricated resume. "We actually have an immediate opening on the evening shift at one of our corporate clients downtown. The pay is $15 an hour to start, with opportunities for advancement based on performance and additional training." "That sounds great," Marcus replied. "When would I start?" "How about tomorrow? You'd be working with some of our experienced guards who can show you the ropes. The client is a financial services company, so it's a professional environment with specific protocols to follow." As Sandra explained the job details, Marcus felt conflicted. She was doing exactly what he would want any HR representative to do, treating applicants with respect and providing clear information. But he was also aware that Carlos had just left the building looking like he'd been disciplined or worse. After completing the hiring paperwork, Sandra walked him back toward the reception area. "You'll report directly to Jim Morrison, our regional manager," she said. "He's in meetings this morning, but you'll meet him tomorrow when you start your first shift." Marcus's stomach tightened at the mention of Morrison's name. Tomorrow, he would finally meet the man whose behavior had triggered this entire investigation. That evening, Marcus called Angela from his hotel room. "How did it go?" she asked. "Complicated," Marcus admitted. "The HR process was exactly what it should be. Professional, respectful, efficient. But there's definitely something else going on beneath the surface. Maybe the complaints were exaggerated," Angela suggested hopefully. "Maybe," Marcus said. But he thought about Carlos's expression and Ashley's barely concealed concern. "I guess I'll find out tomorrow." Marcus's first day as a security guard began at 4 in the afternoon. He reported to the Williams Security Solutions office and was introduced to Tommy Martinez, a veteran guard who would be training him. Tommy was a stocky man in his 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "Welcome to the machine," Tommy said as they walked to the parking garage. "You seem like a decent guy, so I'm going to give you some advice right up front. Keep your head down, do your job, and don't make waves. That's how you survive here." They drove in a company vehicle to downtown Chicago, where their client occupied 15 floors of a gleaming office tower. As they rode the elevator to the security desk, Tommy continued his informal orientation. "The work itself isn't bad," he explained. "We monitor entrances, do floor sweeps, check in with cleaning crews. Most of the time it's boring, which is how we like it. The problems come from management." "What kind of problems?" Marcus asked. Tommy glanced around to make sure they were alone in the elevator. "Depends who you are. If you're white, male, and good at kissing ass, you'll do fine. If you're anything else, well," he shrugged. "You'll see." The evening shift was relatively quiet. Marcus learned the building layouts, security protocols, and client requirements. The work was straightforward and professional, exactly what he expected from a Williams Security Solutions contract. But as the night progressed, he began to understand what Tommy had meant about management problems. Around 9 o'clock, Jim Morrison arrived for one of his unscheduled visits. Marcus recognized him immediately from company photos, but seeing him in person was different. Morrison was a tall man with an aggressive bearing who seemed to command attention through intimidation rather than respect. "Tommy, who's the new guy?" Morrison asked, looking Marcus up and down like he was evaluating livestock. "Marcus Johnson," Tommy replied. "Started today. Sandra hired him." Morrison's expression suggested he had opinions about Sandra's hiring decisions. "Hope you're better than the last guy we had to let go," he said to Marcus. "We don't have time for people who can't handle the basics." "I'll do my best, sir," Marcus replied, suppressing his instinct to match Morrison's aggressive tone. Morrison spent the next hour conducting what he called an inspection, but Marcus recognized it as something else entirely. Morrison was establishing dominance, making sure everyone understood who was in charge. He criticized Tommy's paperwork, questioned security procedures, and generally created an atmosphere of tension and anxiety. After Morrison left, Tommy was visibly frustrated. "See what I mean?" he said. "That man has a talent for making everyone miserable." "Has he always been like that?" Marcus asked. "Worse lately," Tommy admitted. "Ever since corporate started getting complaints, he's been on edge, taking it out on everyone, especially anyone he thinks might be a problem." Marcus filed away that information. Morrison knew about the complaints and was responding with increased intimidation rather than self-reflection or behavior modification. The real education began during Marcus's second week. Morrison had assigned him to work several shifts with different partners, and each guard had stories that painted a consistent picture of systematic discrimination. He worked with Janet Kim, a Korean-American woman who had been with the company for 6 years. She told him how Morrison consistently scheduled her for the least desirable shifts and locations despite her seniority and excellent performance reviews. "I've asked for better assignments," she said during a quiet moment in their patrol. "Morrison always has excuses, says clients have preferences, or that I need more experience, or that my English isn't clear enough for certain positions." Marcus was furious. Janet's English was perfectly clear, and he knew from her file that she had a degree in criminal justice from Northwestern University. Morrison was using manufactured excuses to limit her opportunities. A few days later, Marcus worked with Deshaun Williams, a young black man who had recently completed additional training in cybersecurity. Deshaun was smart, motivated, and exactly the kind of employee who should have been fast-tracked for advancement. Instead, Morrison kept him in entry-level positions. "I've applied for 3 different supervisory positions in the past year," Deshaun told Marcus. "Morrison always finds reasons why I'm not ready. Says I need more experience or that I don't have the right leadership qualities. Meanwhile, white guys with less experience and training get promoted ahead of me." Marcus began to see the sophisticated nature of Morrison's discrimination. He wasn't using obvious racist language or making blatantly illegal decisions. Instead, he was using subjective criteria like leadership qualities, communication skills, and cultural fit to justify decisions that had clear discriminatory patterns. The breaking point came during Marcus's 3rd week. He was working the day shift with Maria Santos, a Latina guard who had been with the company for 4 years. Maria was one of the most competent security professionals Marcus had ever observed. She knew every protocol, maintained excellent relationships with clients, and had never had a disciplinary action on her record. Around 2 in the afternoon, Morrison arrived for another of his surprise inspections. This time, he seemed particularly aggressive, almost like he was looking for problems. He found his target when he discovered that Maria had modified her patrol route to accommodate a client's special event. "Who authorized you to change the patrol schedule?" Morrison demanded. "The client requested it this morning," Maria explained calmly. "They're hosting a board meeting and asked us to minimize foot traffic past their conference room." "And you thought you had the authority to make that decision on your own?" Marcus watched the interaction carefully. Maria had made exactly the right choice, showing initiative and client service that should have been commended. But Morrison was treating it as insubordination. "I made a judgment call based on client needs," Maria said. "I documented it in the log and was planning to inform you during your next visit. Your job is to follow procedures, not make judgment calls," Morrison said loudly enough for other building occupants to hear. "Maybe if you spent more time focusing on your actual responsibilities instead of trying to impress people, you'd understand that." Marcus felt his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. Morrison was publicly humiliating a good employee for doing exactly what company training taught guards to do. But the worst was yet to come. "I'm writing you up for failing to follow established procedures," Morrison continued. "And since this isn't your first issue with taking unauthorized initiative, I'm recommending you for additional training." Marcus knew from Maria's personnel file that she had never been disciplined for anything. Morrison was creating a false narrative that would justify future adverse actions against her. It was a textbook example of how systematic discrimination operated in modern workplaces. After Morrison left, Maria was visibly shaken. "I don't understand what I did wrong," she said. Marcus wanted to tell her she had done nothing wrong, that Morrison was the problem, that she was being targeted because of her ethnicity and gender. Instead, he could only offer comfort and support while maintaining his cover. Marcus had been undercover for 6 weeks when the situation that would force his hand finally arrived. It started on a Thursday morning when he noticed that Deshaun Williams wasn't at the morning briefing. Deshaun was one of the most reliable guards in the Chicago office, never missing shifts without notification. Tommy Martinez pulled Marcus aside after the briefing. "Deshaun called in sick yesterday, and today," he said quietly. "But word is he's not really sick. Morrison wrote him up for something bogus, and Deshaun's thinking about quitting rather than deal with the harassment." Marcus felt his carefully maintained emotional distance evaporating. Deshaun was exactly the kind of employee Williams Security Solutions needed to retain and promote. He was smart, dedicated, and had the potential to become an excellent manager if given the opportunity. Losing him because of Morrison's prejudice was unacceptable. That afternoon, Marcus made an unauthorized decision. During his lunch break, he drove to Deshaun's apartment complex on the south side. He had gotten the address from company records, knowing it was a violation of privacy policies, but no longer caring about the technical rules that protected Morrison's ability to abuse his authority. Deshaun answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking surprised and slightly worried to see a coworker at his home. "Marcus? What are you doing here? Is everything okay at work? Can I come in?" Marcus asked. "I wanted to check on you." Deshaun's small apartment was clean and organized, with books on criminal justice and business management stacked on every available surface. A laptop was open on the kitchen table, showing what appeared to be job search websites. "You don't need to worry about me," Deshaun said, but his voice carried defeat rather than conviction. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," Marcus replied. "And you shouldn't have to be fine with what Morrison is doing to you." Deshaun's eyes widened slightly. In the few weeks they had worked together, Marcus had been supportive but careful not to directly criticize management. This was the first time he had explicitly acknowledged what they both knew was happening. "What Morrison is doing to me," Deshaun repeated. "You mean treating me like every other employee?" Marcus saw through the defensive sarcasm. Deshaun was protecting himself by pretending the discrimination was normal, acceptable, just part of the job. It was a survival mechanism that Marcus recognized from his own experiences with prejudice early in his military career. "Deshaun, You're one of the best security professionals I've ever worked with, Marcus said. You have more knowledge, better instincts, and stronger work ethic than half the supervisors in that office. Morrison is holding you back because of who you are, not what you can do. For a moment, Deshawn's carefully maintained facade cracked. Even if that's true, what am I supposed to do about it? Morrison has all the power. If I complain, he'll find ways to make my life even worse. If I don't complain, nothing changes. Either way, I'm stuck. Marcus understood the impossible position Deshawn was in, because it was the same position that Maria, Janet, Carlos, and countless other employees faced. Morrison had created a system where resistance was futile and compliance was degrading. What if Morrison wasn't the problem anymore? Marcus asked carefully. Deshawn looked at him suspiciously. What do you mean? Marcus was approaching dangerous territory. He couldn't reveal his identity without compromising the investigation, but he needed to give Deshawn hope that change was possible. What if someone with real authority was paying attention to what's happening here? What if the people at corporate actually cared about fixing this? You think corporate doesn't know? Deshawn asked bitterly. Morrison's been doing this for years. His branch meets all the financial targets. His reports always look good, and the complaints disappear into the bureaucracy. Corporate doesn't want to know. Marcus felt the weight of Deshawn's cynicism and realized how much damage Morrison had done to employee faith in the company's leadership. Even if Marcus revealed himself right now, Deshawn might not believe that change was possible. What if I told you that someone was documenting everything Morrison does? Marcus asked, building a case that couldn't be ignored or buried. Deshawn studied Marcus's face carefully. Are you that someone? Marcus chose his words carefully. I'm someone who believes things can change. But I need people like you to trust the process a little longer. They talked for another hour. Marcus couldn't make specific promises or reveal details, but he tried to convey that Deshawn's situation wasn't hopeless. When he left, Deshawn seemed slightly more willing to continue fighting rather than simply walking away. The next morning, Deshawn returned to work. Morrison seemed surprised to see him, and Marcus noticed a flicker of annoyance cross the regional manager's face. Morrison had apparently expected his intimidation tactics to drive Deshawn away permanently. Feeling better? Morrison asked with false concern. Much better, thank you, Deshawn replied politely. Marcus could see the effort it took Deshawn to maintain his composure. But there was something else in Deshawn's demeanor, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Morrison noticed it too. Over the next few days, Morrison seemed to be testing Deshawn's renewed resilience. He assigned him the worst shifts, criticized his work more frequently, and generally increased the pressure. But Deshawn endured it with a steady determination that clearly frustrated Morrison. The crisis came the following Tuesday. Marcus was working the evening shift with Janet Kim when they received an emergency call from one of their corporate clients. A security alarm had been triggered in the building's data center, and they needed immediate response. Janet and Marcus arrived at the scene within minutes. Janet quickly assessed the situation and determined that the alarm had been caused by a maintenance worker who had entered the restricted area without following proper protocols. She efficiently handled the situation, coordinated with building management, and filed all the necessary reports. It was textbook security work, exactly what clients paid Williams Security Solutions to provide. But when Morrison arrived 30 minutes later, he focused on finding fault rather than acknowledging good performance. Why didn't you call me immediately when the alarm went off? Morrison demanded. I followed the established protocol, Janet replied. The emergency procedures specify that we handle the immediate response and notify management after the situation is secured. I don't care what the procedures say, Morrison snapped. When something like this happens, I want to know immediately. Marcus watched this exchange with growing anger. Morrison was criticizing Janet for following the exact procedures that Marcus himself had helped develop. The protocols were designed to ensure fast response times and clear communication, and Janet had executed them perfectly. Janet handled this exactly right, Marcus said, unable to stay silent any longer. Morrison turned his attention to Marcus with visible surprise. In 6 weeks of working together, Marcus had been careful to avoid direct confrontations. His sudden defense of Janet was unexpected and unwelcome. I don't remember asking for your opinion, Morrison said coldly. You didn't ask for mine either, But I can see good security work when it happens, Marcus replied. Janet saved this client from a potential security breach and handled the whole situation professionally. Morrison's face reddened. He wasn't used to being challenged by entry-level employees, especially not in front of other staff members. Maybe you need to worry more about your own performance and less about defending your partner. My performance is fine, Marcus said, and so is hers. If you have specific criticisms of how we handled this incident, I'd like to hear them. Marcus knew he was crossing a line, but weeks of watching Morrison abuse good employees had worn away his patience. He was tired of hiding behind his false identity while people he respected were being mistreated. Morrison stepped closer, using his height and aggressive posture to intimidate. Your attitude is becoming a problem, Johnson. Maybe you need to think about whether this job is really a good fit for you. My attitude, Marcus replied, his voice rising slightly. I think the problem is your attitude toward employees who actually know how to do their jobs. The confrontation was interrupted by Janet, who clearly sensed that the situation was escalating dangerously. Let's all just focus on finishing the incident report, she said diplomatically. But Morrison wasn't finished. He had been challenged publicly, and his authority had been questioned. He needed to reassert control. Johnson, you're off the schedule for the rest of the week, Morrison announced. Consider it suspension without pay while I decide whether you belong in this company. Marcus felt his carefully constructed undercover operation collapsing around him. But he also realized that he no longer cared about maintaining his cover. Morrison had just demonstrated exactly the kind of abusive management that was destroying the company culture Marcus had spent decades building. You can't suspend someone for defending a colleague who did excellent work, Marcus said. Marcus sat in his hotel room that night, staring at his phone and wondering how to explain to his wife that he had just been fired from his own company. The irony was almost laughable, except that nothing about this situation was funny. He had uncovered systematic discrimination, gathered evidence of management abuse, and witnessed the destruction of everything he had tried to build. Now he was unemployed and facing the most difficult decision of his professional life. He could reveal his identity immediately, fire Morrison, and implement corrective measures throughout the Chicago office. It would be the fastest way to address the immediate problems and restore order. But Marcus had learned enough about corporate dynamics to know that quick fixes often created new problems. Morrison had allies throughout the company, relationships with clients, and 8 years of carefully constructed narratives about his management effectiveness. More importantly, Marcus had gained insights that would have been impossible from his executive position. He understood how discrimination operated at ground level, how good employees adapted to toxic management, and how corporate policies could be manipulated to protect bad actors. This knowledge was valuable, but only if he used it strategically. Marcus called Patricia from his hotel room. I need you to arrange a meeting with our employment law firm, he said. Tomorrow morning, confidentially. Marcus, what happened? You sound different. I got fired, he said simply. There was a long pause. From your own company? From my own company, by my own regional manager, for defending an employee who was doing excellent work. Patricia's sharp intake of breath told Marcus everything he needed to know about how this would play with people who understood the business. What do you want to do? I want to do this right, Marcus said. No shortcuts, no executive privilege, no quick fixes that leave the underlying problems intact. The next morning, Marcus met with Jennifer Walsh, the senior partner at the law firm that handled Williams Security Solutions' employment issues. Jennifer was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her career on complex workplace discrimination cases. She listened to Marcus's account with growing amazement and occasional bursts of professional admiration for the thoroughness of his undercover investigation. You've documented a textbook case of systematic workplace discrimination, Jennifer said, reviewing the notes and recordings Marcus had compiled. Morrison's behavior creates massive liability for the company, and the pattern you've identified suggests this has been going on for years. What are my options? Marcus asked. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, considering the unprecedented situation of a CEO who had been discriminated against in his own company. Legally, you have several paths. You could file a wrongful termination suit as Marcus Johnson, then reveal your identity during the discovery process. You could reveal yourself immediately and Handle this as an internal matter. Or you could treat this as a whistleblower situation and work with external agencies. What would you recommend? As your attorney, I'd normally recommend the path that minimizes legal exposure and resolves the situation quickly. But as someone who has spent decades fighting workplace discrimination, I think you have an opportunity to do something unprecedented here. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Most discrimination cases involve employees fighting uphill battles against powerful corporate structures. Victims usually have limited resources, face retaliation for speaking out, and often settle for small changes that don't address systemic problems. But you're in a unique position. You have all the evidence, all the resources, and all the authority needed to create real change. Jennifer pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out a strategy that was unlike anything Marcus had considered. What if we treated this as a comprehensive reform initiative rather than just a personnel problem? You use your experience and evidence to rebuild the entire management structure, not just in Chicago, but throughout the company. Marcus was intrigued, but cautious. How would that work practically? First, we document everything through proper legal channels. File complaints with EEOC, state civil rights agencies, and labor departments. Create an official record that can't be buried or manipulated. Then, we use that process to implement company-wide reforms that address the systemic issues you've identified. The strategy was ambitious and risky. It would expose Williams' security solutions to government scrutiny, potential lawsuits from affected employees, and negative publicity that could damage client relationships. But it would also demonstrate the kind of leadership and ethical commitment that Marcus had always claimed to represent. There's one more thing to consider, Jennifer added. If you do this right, you could become a model for how companies should address discrimination. Other CEOs are watching cases like this, trying to understand how to handle similar problems in their own organizations. Marcus spent the weekend thinking about Jennifer's proposal and consulting with Angela, his children, and a few trusted business mentors. The consensus was that he had stumbled into an opportunity to align his actions with his values in a way that few business leaders ever experienced. On Monday morning, Marcus called a meeting with his senior leadership team in Atlanta. He invited Janet Rodriguez from HR, his CFO David Chun, his COO Michael Thompson, and the heads of all regional offices except Chicago. Morrison wasn't included, and his absence created obvious tension in the room. I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, Marcus began. For the past 6 weeks, I've been working undercover as a security guard in our Chicago office. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Marcus could see his executives processing this information, trying to understand the implications and figure out how to respond. Why would you do something like that? Michael Thompson asked carefully. Marcus explained about the discrimination complaints, his decision to investigate personally, and what he had discovered about Morrison's management practices. As he shared specific examples of what he had witnessed, he watched his leadership team's expressions change from confusion to concern to anger. Morrison suspended me on Friday for defending Janet Kim when she handled an emergency situation perfectly, Marcus concluded. He didn't know who I was, but he saw an employee standing up for a colleague and decided that was grounds for termination. Janet Rodriguez was the first to speak. Marcus, I had no idea the situation in Chicago was that bad. Some of those incidents you described should have triggered immediate investigations. They would have, if they had reached you, Marcus replied. Morrison has been very effective at managing information flow and controlling narratives. But the bigger problem is that our corporate structure makes it too easy for bad managers to hide behind policies and procedures. David Chun leaned forward. What do you want to do about this? Marcus outlined Jennifer Walsh's strategy for comprehensive reform. He explained how they could use the legal process to examine every aspect of their management practices, implement new oversight systems, and demonstrate genuine commitment to workplace equality. This won't be easy or comfortable, Marcus warned. We'll be inviting government agencies into our business, exposing ourselves to lawsuits, and admitting that we've failed to protect our own employees. Some clients might be concerned about working with a company that's under investigation. Michael Thompson raised the obvious question. What happens to Morrison? Morrison will be terminated immediately for cause, Marcus said. But Firing him is the easy part. The hard part is fixing the systems that allowed him to operate for 8 years without effective oversight. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus's leadership team developed a comprehensive response plan. They would immediately place the Chicago office under direct supervision from Atlanta, conduct interviews with all employees to identify additional problems, implement new reporting procedures that bypassed regional management, and work with employment law experts to ensure full compliance with civil rights regulations. Marcus also made a decision that surprised his team. "I'm going to remain Marcus Johnson for the legal proceedings," he said. "The wrongful termination suit and discrimination complaints will be filed by the employee who was actually mistreated, not by the CEO trying to fix a problem." Janet Rodriguez looked concerned. "That's going to create complications. How do we explain that the person filing complaints against our company is also the person who owns the company?" "We tell the truth," Marcus said simply. "We explain that systematic discrimination is so embedded in our Chicago operation that it affected employees regardless of their background, qualifications, or even their corporate authority. The fact that I experienced the same treatment as every other minority employee proves the point." The strategy was unprecedented, and Marcus knew it would generate significant media attention and legal complexity. But he was committed to following through on the principles that had guided his undercover investigation. That afternoon, Marcus called Deshaun Williams at home. "It's Marcus Johnson," he said. "I wanted you to know that things are about to change at the Chicago office." "What do you mean?" 6 months after Marcus Williams was fired from his own company, he stood in a federal courthouse in Chicago, waiting to testify in a case that had captured national attention. The headlines in major business publications read like something from a legal thriller. "CEO goes undercover, gets fired for fighting discrimination," and "the billionaire who sued his own company." The case had evolved far beyond Marcus's original investigation. What began as an effort to understand workplace problems in one branch office had become a landmark legal proceeding with implications for corporate governance, employment law, and executive accountability across American business. The immediate aftermath of Morrison's termination had been chaotic. Word spread quickly through the Chicago office that their regional manager had been fired for discrimination, but nobody understood the connection to Marcus Johnson, the security guard who had been suspended the same week. Most employees assumed it was a coincidence until Jennifer Walsh filed formal complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on behalf of Marcus Johnson and 12 other employees. Deshaun Williams had been the first to piece together the truth. 3 days after Morrison's termination, he called Marcus at his hotel. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Deshaun said. "About someone building a case and documenting everything. That someone was you, wasn't it?" Marcus had been dreading this conversation, but also looking forward to it. "Yes," he said simply. "And you're not just some guy who cares about justice. You're someone with the power to actually do something about it." "Yes." Deshaun was quiet for a long time. "Who are you really, Marcus?" "I'm Marcus Williams. I founded and own Williams Security Solutions." The silence on the phone stretched so long that Marcus thought Deshaun had hung up. Finally, Deshaun spoke, his voice filled with amazement and confusion. "You're the CEO? You've been the CEO this whole time." "I've been your colleague," Marcus corrected. "The CEO thing is just my day job." Over the following weeks, Marcus revealed his identity to each of the employees he had worked with during his undercover operation. The reactions varied from shock to gratitude to anger that he had deceived them. Janet Kim was initially upset about the deception, but came to understand why Marcus had felt it necessary. Tommy Martinez laughed and said he should have known that Marcus was too smart and too principled to be just another security guard. Maria Santos had the most complex reaction. She was grateful that someone in authority had witnessed Morrison's discrimination firsthand. But she was also hurt that Marcus had watched her be humiliated without intervening immediately. It took several conversations for her to understand that Marcus's intervention as CEO would have been less effective than his documentation as a witness. The legal proceedings moved forward with unprecedented complexity. Marcus was simultaneously the plaintiff filing discrimination complaints and the defendant company being accused of systematic civil rights violations. Jennifer Walsh had assembled a team of employment law specialists to navigate the unique legal and ethical issues involved. The EEOC investigation revealed that Morrison's discrimination had been more extensive than even Marcus realized. Over 8 years, Morrison had systematically excluded minorities and women from leadership positions, manipulated performance reviews to justify adverse actions, and created a hostile work environment that led to high turnover among the very employees Williams Security Solutions most needed to retain. But the investigation also revealed something that shocked Marcus. Morrison hadn't been acting alone. The company's corporate structure had enabled his discrimination through policies that were neutral on paper, but discriminatory in practice. Promotion criteria that emphasized subjective leadership qualities, evaluation systems that relied heavily on manager discretion, and reporting procedures that channeled complaints through regional management had all contributed to the systematic exclusion of qualified minority employees. Your company has been accidentally discriminating for years, Jennifer Walsh explained during one of their strategy sessions. Morrison was the most obvious problem, but the system that allowed him to operate is the real issue. Marcus realized that his undercover investigation had uncovered more than individual misconduct. It had revealed fundamental flaws in the corporate culture he had spent decades building. The discovery was humbling and horrifying, but also provided a roadmap for genuine reform. The business implications were severe, but not fatal. Several clients initially expressed concerns about working with a company under federal investigation for civil rights violations. But Marcus's transparent handling of the situation and his commitment to comprehensive reform actually strengthened some client relationships. Companies that were dealing with their own diversity and inclusion challenges saw Williams Security Solutions as a partner that understood the complexities of workplace discrimination. Media coverage was intense and largely positive. Marcus's decision to experience discrimination firsthand rather than rely on traditional corporate investigations resonated with business leaders and civil rights advocates alike. He was invited to speak at conferences on corporate governance, featured in Harvard Business Review case studies, and consulted by other CEOs facing similar challenges. But the personal costs were significant. Marcus's relationship with some long-term employees was permanently changed by the revelation that he had been undercover among them. Several executives who had worked with Morrison felt betrayed that Marcus had investigated them secretly rather than addressing his concerns directly. Marcus's family also struggled with the aftermath. The media attention brought scrutiny to every aspect of their lives, and Marcus's children faced questions from friends and colleagues about their father's unusual approach to business management. Angela supported Marcus's decisions, but worried about the long-term impact on their family's privacy and security. The federal trial began 8 months after Marcus's termination as Marcus Johnson. The case had attracted attention from civil rights organizations, business groups, and legal scholars interested in the precedent it might establish for corporate accountability. Marcus testified for 3 days about his experiences as an undercover employee. The courtroom was packed with journalists, employment lawyers, and business executives curious to hear firsthand how systematic discrimination operated at ground level. Mr. Williams, the prosecutor asked, what did you learn from your undercover investigation that you couldn't have learned as CEO? Marcus had thought about this question for months. I learned that discrimination isn't always obvious or intentional, he said. Morrison believed he was making good business decisions based on objective criteria, but his unconscious biases led him to consistently undervalue minority employees and overvalue employees who looked and thought like him. And what did you learn about your company's policies and procedures? I learned that we had created systems that enabled discrimination while appearing to prevent it. Our promotion criteria sounded fair, but they gave managers like Morrison the discretion to make subjective decisions based on unconscious bias. Our complaint procedures appeared comprehensive, but they allowed regional managers to control information and intimidate potential complainants. The defense attorney, representing Williams Security Solutions, asked Marcus to explain why he hadn't used traditional corporate investigation methods. Because traditional methods rely on the same systems and people that created the problems, Marcus replied. Morrison had 8 years to perfect his ability to manage corporate investigations. He knew how to present himself to upper management, how to explain away complaints, and how to retaliate against employees without creating obvious legal exposure. So you chose deception instead of transparency? Marcus considered the question carefully. I chose to experience the truth instead of accepting carefully managed presentations of the truth. The trial lasted 6 weeks and included testimony from over 40 employees who had worked under Morrison's management. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination that had been hidden from corporate oversight through sophisticated manipulation of policies and procedures. The verdict was unanimous. Williams Security Solutions was liable for the discriminatory treatment of multiple employees under Morrison's management. But the court also recognized Marcus's unprecedented efforts to address the discrimination once he became aware of it. The financial settlement was substantial but not devastating. Williams Security Solutions paid $4.2 million to affected employees and agreed to implement comprehensive reforms overseen by a federal monitor for 3 years. Morrison was personally liable for $800,000 in punitive damages and was permanently barred from management positions in companies with federal contracts. But the real impact was cultural and systemic. Williams Security Solutions became a model for how companies could proactively address workplace discrimination. The reforms implemented during the federal oversight period were so successful that other corporations began adopting similar approaches voluntarily. Marcus's leadership style was permanently changed by his undercover experience. He instituted regular programs where senior executives worked alongside entry-level employees, not undercover but openly, to maintain connections with ground-level operations. He restructured promotion and evaluation systems to minimize subjective bias and created multiple reporting channels for discrimination complaints. Most importantly, Marcus changed his own relationship with company employees. Instead of relying on filtered information from regional managers, he maintained direct relationships with employees at all levels. The CEO, who had once governed from a corner office, became known for his presence on work sites and his accessibility to employees with concerns. 5 years after the trial, Marcus reflected on the experience during a speech at his alma mater's business school. "I thought I was investigating discrimination in one branch office," he told the students. "What I discovered was that discrimination was embedded in systems I had created with the best intentions. The most shocking part wasn't Morrison's behavior, but how long it took someone with all my resources and authority to recognize what was happening to our employees." Deshaun Williams, who had been promoted to Regional Security Director, introduced Marcus at the event. "Marcus taught me that leadership isn't about having authority," Deshaun said. "It's about being willing to give up authority to do what's right." Marcus's journey from CEO to fired security guard to civil rights advocate had changed more than his company. It had demonstrated that real leadership required the courage to experience problems firsthand rather than managing them from a distance. The Williams Security Solutions case became required reading in business ethics courses and a benchmark for corporate accountability in civil rights law. But for Marcus, the most important outcome was simpler. No employee in his company would ever again face the choice between enduring discrimination and finding another job. The CEO, who had been fired for protecting a colleague, had learned that sometimes losing everything was the only way to build something worth having. Morrison has been terminated, and the company is implementing major reforms to address the discrimination issues you and others have experienced. I also wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak with our investigators about your experiences. Deshaun was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, can I ask you something? Who are you really?" Marcus had been dreading this question, but he owed Deshaun honesty. "I'm someone who believes you deserve better than what you've been getting. And I'm someone who's going to make sure you get it." That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now. But I promise you'll understand everything soon. When Marcus hung up, he realized that maintaining his dual identity was becoming increasingly difficult. Soon, he would have to reveal the truth to the employees who had trusted him as Marcus Johnson while implementing reforms as Marcus Williams. The transition would be delicate and potentially damaging to relationships he had built during his weeks undercover. But Marcus was committed to seeing this through. He had learned that real leadership required more than good intentions and corporate policies. It required personal sacrifice, uncomfortable choices, and the willingness to risk everything for principles that mattered more than profit. The next phase of his journey would test every aspect of his character and his company's values. "I can suspend you for whatever reason I choose," Morrison replied. Insubordination, failure to respect authority, disruptive behavior in front of clients. Pick one. Marcus looked at Janet's worried face and realized that his response to this moment would define not just his undercover investigation, but the kind of leader he was willing to be. He could accept the suspension, maintain his cover, and continue gathering evidence. Or he could stand up for what was right and accept the consequences. "You're right," Marcus said calmly. "You can suspend me. But you're still wrong about Janet. You're wrong about your management style. And you're wrong about what this company is supposed to represent." Morrison's smile was triumphant and ugly. "Clear out your locker. Security will escort you from the building." As Marcus gathered his few personal belongings from the security office, he realized that his undercover operation had revealed more than he had expected to learn. Morrison wasn't just discriminating against certain employees. He was systematically destroying the culture that Marcus had tried to create throughout the entire company. But Marcus had also learned something else. There were employees like Janet, Deshawn, Maria, and Tommy who still believed in doing good work despite the obstacles they faced. They deserved better leadership than they were getting. As building security escorted him out of his own company's office, Marcus knew that his real work was just beginning. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue to watch Morrison destroy good employees while hiding behind his false identity. But he also couldn't reveal himself without compromising the investigation and potentially allowing Morrison to escape consequences. Marcus decided to become an ally rather than just an observer. He began documenting everything Morrison did, collecting evidence that could be used to build a comprehensive case against him. He also started building relationships with the affected employees, offering support and encouragement without revealing his true identity. What Marcus didn't know was that his increased activism was beginning to attract Morrison's attention. Morrison had noticed that some employees seemed more confident lately, more willing to question his decisions. He was starting to suspect that someone was encouraging resistance to his authority. The confrontation Marcus had been dreading was approaching faster than he realized. Examples throughout his life where good intentions and well-designed processes failed because people found ways to exploit them. In the military, he had learned that the only way to truly understand a situation was to experience it firsthand. Leadership from a distance was just management, and management could be manipulated. As his plane descended into Chicago the next morning, Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. He was about to discover whether his life's work had been built on genuine values or comfortable illusions. Either way, he knew there would be no going back to the ignorance that had protected him from this reality. The Chicago branch office was located in a modern building in the Loop, serving clients throughout the metropolitan area. Marcus had visited the office several times over the years for official functions, but always as the CEO, surrounded by management staff and carefully orchestrated presentations. This time, he would see it through the eyes of someone who needed the job, someone who had no power, someone who could be dismissed or mistreated without consequence. He checked into a modest hotel under his assumed name and prepared for the most important performance of his life. Tomorrow, he would walk into Williams Security Solutions as Marcus Johnson, job applicant, and discover what his company really was when no one important was watching. He expected